Welcome to our deep dive, everybody. Today, we're going to be checking out Psalm 44.
Okay.
It's a pretty intense piece of poetry, full of
Yeah.
really, really raw emotion and big questions about, faith and suffering and all that.
Mm-hmm.
What's so wild about this psalm is, it takes you on such a roller coaster, an emotional roller coaster, It starts out with this, crazy confidence, then it just plunges right into this lament, so sad and heavy.
Yeah.
And then it finishes up with, a desperate plea for help. So how does that even happen? How can something start out so strong and then, bam, take such a dark turn?
Well, right off the bat, it's important to remember who's talking here, right?
Okay.
This psalm is attributed to the sons of Korah.
Okay.
And the sons of Korah were Levites. So basically they were part of the priestly tribe in Israel.
Yeah.
They were dedicated to serving in the temple. So they weren't just singing about God's power on the weekends. They were living and breathing it every single day. Their entire history, their family tradition, everything was steeped in it.
So they knew what they were talking about.
Oh, absolutely. And you can really hear that in the first few verses where they're talking about their ancestors, right? How they conquered lands, not by their own strength,
Right.
but by God's favor. There's that line, you by your power defeated nations and settled our fathers on their land.
Wow.
It's like they're painting this picture of God as this divine warrior, fighting on their behalf.
Yeah, and they're using those historical stories almost
Why?
they're reminding God of all the times he's come through for them in the past. Almost like they're reminding themselves too.
Exactly. It's like building a case, right?
Yeah.
And then you get to verse 8, and there's that word Selah.
Okay.
It's this Hebrew word that pops up all over the songs.
Mm-hmm.
Scholars, they still debate what it actually means,
Oh, really?
Yeah. Some people think it was a musical thing, like a pause. Okay.
Or a change in the melody.
Interesting.
Others think it was more of a literary device, like a signal to stop and think about what you've just heard.
So either way, a moment of reflection.
Exactly. But it also creates this sense of, anticipation, something's about to change.
Okay, so we've got this super confident opening, a little pause for reflection, and then, well, things get a lot more complicated.
You could say that. Starting in verse 9, the whole mood just flips, We go from this triumphant celebration of God's power to this outpouring of pain and confusion. It's like whiplash.
Yeah, verse 9, like you said, it's almost like a punch to the gut. It's like all of a sudden, bam, they're talking about feeling rejected, abandoned, even humiliated. It's brutal. There's that line, you handed us over like sheep to be eaten. And it's
heavy stuff.
It's really intense, right? It really makes you feel how deep their despair is.
Yeah. And what's striking is that this shift, this going from praise to lament, from blessing to suffering, that's kind of a recurring theme in the Psalms.
Yeah. It's it reflects how complicated it is to live out your faith, We don't always get what God's doing. Sometimes even when you think you're doing everything right, bad stuff still happens.
It's that classic question, man. Why do bad things happen to good people?
What?
It sounds like the sons of Korah are wrestling with that very question.
Oh, for sure. And they don't hold back either. They go straight to God with their confusion and frustration. They're not afraid to say, we don't get it. What's going on here?
So even though they're questioning God, they're still talking to him.
Yeah.
It's not like they've given up on him completely.
Right, exactly. Their questioning is coming from a place of belief. It's like they're saying, look, we know you're there. We know you're powerful. So why is this happening?
That's a good point. It's not blind faith, right? It's more like...
right.
Wrestling with the tough questions, even challenging God when you need to.
Yeah.
So they've poured their hearts out, they've laid out their pain, and now they're going to try to defend themselves.
Yeah, it's like they're making their case before a judge.
Okay.
They're saying, we haven't rejected you. We stayed true to the path. It's like they're adamant that they haven't done anything to deserve this.
And then get to verse 21 with that really powerful question. If we had rejected our God, would not God discover it? It's like they're appealing to God's
right.
omniscience. Is that the word?
Yeah, exactly. They're saying, look, you see everything. You know our hearts. You know we haven't abandoned you. Which, that really highlights this tension, this disconnect they're feeling between, being faithful and still suffering. It's like they're trying to make sense of how those two things can exist at the same time.
So they've reaffirmed their faith. They've laid out all their pain and confusion. And now it feels like they're reaching a breaking point. Where do they go from here?
Well, that takes us to their final plea. It's raw, it's desperate, and that's where we'll pick up next time.
Sounds good.
So yeah, this final plea, it's in verses 23, 26. And this is where it all just comes pouring out, you know? They don't hold anything back.
Yeah, it's like they've reached this point of like complete surrender, where all they can do is just cry out to God.
It's raw, it's vulnerable.
Yeah.
Really powerful. Verse 25, man, that one hits hard. They say, "For we lie in the dirt with our bellies pressed to the ground."
It's heavy.
Yeah.
You can just feel like the weight of their despair in those words, you know?
Absolutely.
In that imagery, like prostrating themselves before God. I wonder, like, back then, would people have immediately, you know, grasped the significance of that?
Oh, I'm sure they would. Prostration, that was like a huge sign of submission and humility back then, you know? Especially in that part of the world.
Right.
So for them to use that imagery, it would have been like a total surrender, you know?
Complete reliance on God.
Yeah, like we're at your mercy.
Wow. So after all of this, after pouring their hearts out, do they, like, get a response?
Well, that's what makes the Psalm so interesting, and maybe even a little unsettling for some, because it just ends. There's no resolution.
Really?
Yeah, you don't see how God responds. You don't know what happens next.
It just stops.
Pretty much.
That's kind of wild. I mean, most stories, even the ancient ones, they like to wrap things up, give you a nice little ending, you know?
Right.
Why do you think this one doesn't?
Well, I think that's part of the message, you know? Life and faith, it's not always a clear-cut story with a happy ending.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're just left with questions, with uncertainty.
And that's okay.
Exactly. It's okay to not have all the answers.
It's interesting because even though, like, this was written so long ago, those questions, the ones about suffering and, like, where God is in all of it, those are still things we're dealing with today.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone at some point has felt that, like, loss, that feeling of being abandoned.
Yeah.
Wondering why bad things happen.
It's universal.
Yeah, and I think that's the power of the Psalms, you know? They give a voice to all of it, the good, the bad, the confusing. They show us that it's okay to, you know, doubt, to question, even to get angry with God when you're hurting.
To not have it all figured out.
Exactly.
I'm thinking about, like, the listener right now, you know, maybe they're going through something really tough, feeling lost.
Yeah.
Hearing all this raw emotion, it could really hit home for them.
It could definitely resonate because it reminds them that they're not alone, you know? People have been dealing with these same things forever, you know?
And yet, even though they're in so much pain, even with all the uncertainty, they never totally lose their faith.
Nope.
They still call out to God. They still hold on to that hope.
It's powerful, right? Like,
Yeah.
even when things are at their worst, you can still choose to believe, to trust that there's something bigger going on, even if we can't see it.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. The structure, the emotions, that unresolved ending. It's been quite a deep dive, but there's one more thing I want to touch on, and that's the historical context. We've talked about the emotional journey of the psalm, but does knowing, like, when and why it was written, give us a deeper understanding of its meaning?
Oh, it definitely adds another layer, that's for sure.
Okay.
We don't know the exact historical situation, but scholars think it was probably written during a time of national crisis.
Like when the Israelites were facing some kind of oppression or defeat.
Exactly. So it wasn't just personal suffering, it was like collective suffering, a shared sense of loss and disillusionment.
Wow.
Yeah, which makes their plea for God to intervene even more powerful, you know?
It's like they're saying, hey, we've held up our end of the bargain. We've stayed faithful, so why are you letting our nation fall apart?
Exactly.
That adds a whole other level to those feelings of abandonment and betrayal.
It really does. And it brings up some interesting questions about, like, collective responsibility and theodicy, you know, that question of why a good God would allow suffering, especially on such a massive scale.
It makes you wonder if they're questioning, like, not just God's actions, but also their understanding of the covenant, you know?
Right.
Like, did we get something wrong? Were we wrong to think that being faithful would guarantee our safety and success?
That's a great point. And it's a tension that a lot of people of faith wrestle with, you know, especially when faced with tragedy and injustice.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile the belief in a loving, all-powerful God with the fact that there's so much suffering in the world?
It's a question that doesn't have an easy answer.
No, it doesn't.
But maybe Psalm 44 isn't about giving us answers, you know? Maybe it's about giving us permission to ask those hard questions, to express our doubts and frustrations, to just acknowledge how complicated faith can be, especially when we're dealing with suffering.
I think you've got it. Sometimes the deepest expressions of faith aren't about finding those neat and tidy answers or holding on to simple beliefs. It's about wrestling with the mystery, with the tension, and finding a way to hold on to hope, even when you don't understand everything.
So what can we, the listeners, take away from all of this? Like, what can we learn from this ancient poem?
Well, I think it reminds us that we're not alone in our struggles. People have been grappling with these same questions for centuries. It's okay to doubt, to question, to lament, even to get angry with God when you're hurting.
And that ultimately faith isn't about having all the answers, but about holding on to hope, even when you're not sure, about continuing to search for understanding, even when it feels dark.
Beautifully said. Psalm 44 is a testament to the power of faith, even in the face of unimaginable suffering. It reminds us that our relationship with God can withstand anything, that we can find comfort and strength in the midst of pain and uncertainty.
And that those honest conversations with God, even the ones that are full of anger and confusion, can actually lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves and our faith.
Exactly. Sometimes the most powerful prayers are the ones that come from a place of vulnerability, of questioning, of searching. The ones that don't shy away from the darkness but look for the light within it.
Well, there you have it, folks. Our deep dive into Psalm 44. We've explored its depths, its history, and what it means for us today. We hope this has given you some things to think about, some new perspectives on faith and suffering. Remember, it's okay to wrestle with these questions, to find your own understanding, and to find comfort in knowing that others have walked this path before you, even when it's tough, even when it hurts. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, so it really does, bring up all these questions about, if they were responsible or why God would allow this kind of suffering.
It makes you think, were they questioning their understanding of the covenant? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Did they think, wait, did we miss something here?
Yeah.
We thought, being faithful meant we'd be safe and, successful,
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's something that a lot of people struggle with, throughout history, especially when they see, a tragedy or injustice in the world.
Right. How do you believe in a good and powerful God when there's so much suffering?
That's a tough question. No easy answers.
Maybe Psalm 44 isn't about answers, though. Maybe it's more about, giving us permission to ask the hard questions, to doubt, to get frustrated, to just admit that faith can be complicated, especially when things are hard.
I think that's a really good point. Sometimes faith isn't about finding all the answers or clinging to simple beliefs. It's more about wrestling with the mystery and the tension and holding on to hope even when you don't understand.
So what can we, the listeners, take away from all of this? What can we learn from this ancient poem?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that we're not alone in our struggles. People have been wrestling with these same questions for a really long time. It's okay to doubt, to question, to get upset, even to feel angry with God when things are tough.
And faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about having hope, even when you're not sure about things. And it's about looking for understanding, even when it feels like you're surrounded by darkness.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Psalm 44 really shows the power of faith. Even when things are really bad, it reminds us that our relationship with God can survive anything, that we can find comfort and strength when we're hurting and uncertain.
And sometimes those hard conversations with God, even when we're angry or confused, those can actually lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves and our faith, right?
Absolutely. Sometimes those are the most powerful prayers, the ones that come from a place of honesty, questioning, searching, the ones where we don't hide from the darkness, but try to find the light within it.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into Psalm 44. We covered a lot today, the emotions, the history, and what it means for us now. Hopefully give you some things to think about, some new ways to look at faith and suffering. Remember, it's okay to wrestle with these questions, to figure things out for yourself, and remember that you're not alone. Lots of people have walked this path before, and, it's okay if it's hard, it's okay if it hurts. Thanks for listening, everybody.